What's it like in Extinction Rebellion?
Look, when it started out, it was a very positive group. People had a lot of energy and they wanted positive change. We did a lot of fun actions. We got the public on board. It was good for about, I don't know, 6 months, something like that. And then it started becoming very negative. It started becoming quite apocalyptic.
Hello, and we're back. It's another episode of The Swift Half with Snowdon. With me, Chris Snowdon. It's my show. I'm in charge, and I get to speak to whoever I'm interested in speaking to, and I hope that you'll be interested in them too. This week, without any further ado, I'm very pleased indeed to welcome Xeon Light, who is a former member of the Green Party, former member of Extinction Rebellion. She is the founder and current organisation is Emergency Reactor, which campaigns for more nuclear power. She's also the author of The Ultimate Guide to Green Parenting and various other things. She first shot to attention, I think it's fair to say, with an interview with Andrew Neil a few years ago when he asked her to defend various claims that Extinction Rebellion had been making, and she was unable to do so, and she was very honest about that, and it helped kind of change her mind, I think it's fair to say. Is that right, Zion? You that was the spark that caused you to leave XR?
Well, I chose not to defend them, but then I wondered what I was doing there.
Right.
Which, might sound ridiculous, but there you go. I spent a lifetime in these groups, and it's very hard to question things when you're on the inside. And I was questioning, but Andrew Neil pressing for solutions really made me realize that actually the conversation had changed. It's not about grabbing people's attention anymore. People want to see what solutions are, and I wanted to talk about them, and I wasn't allowed to.
Right, and so that then drew you towards nuclear power. Were you always okay with nuclear power? Or
No, not always. I used to protest it, but that was way back in my Green Party days. As a teenager, I started to change my mind about it, but I noticed that all the Green groups that I was a part of shut down any conversation about it. I left the Green Party over that specifically because they wouldn't even have a discussion about it. They just say, we know it's bad. We know it's bad, Zion. And I'd say, well, what we're going to do with just renewables, is intermittent, it's not going to be enough. And they would say, everyone needs to learn to live with less.
Right.
We recognize that it's intermittent. Everyone needs to. And I started thinking, I don't agree with that. That's energy poverty. We don't want to live like that. So I left that group, and then I joined other groups. Extinction Rebellion was interesting because not everybody was anti there, but we just had a policy that we couldn't discuss it. And I noticed that there were people who were discussing renewables publicly, and they got away with it. I wouldn't say they were allowed to, they got away with it, but I just knew that I couldn't sit there and say nuclear. And then I suddenly thought, you know what, I'm fed up with that. I think someone should go out and say it, and it should be people from these groups, because it stands for all the things that they claim to stand for.
Yes, indeed. Just people get into nuclear as such. What's it like in Extinction Rebellion? I mean, what's the kind of vibe there?
Look, when it started out, it was a very positive group, and there's a lot of turnover. It's volunteers, so people come and go all the time. And I thought it was very positive. I thought people had a lot of energy and they wanted positive change. We did a lot of fun actions. We got the public on board. It was good for about, I don't know, 6 months, something like that. And then it started becoming very negative. It started becoming quite apocalyptic. Certain egotistical figures who I've written about started taking over. And there was this kind of battle on the inside to stop that, but we just couldn't stop it. And that person specifically had a lot of support, and has now gone off and started his own more militant group, which is what he always wanted Extinction Rebellion to be. But we completely lost our way. We came on this group. I wasn't there at the beginning, so they came onto the scene wanting to draw attention to these issues. And I thought, great, this is a good opportunity to go and discuss the science and what we can do about it. And so I got involved as a spokesperson because they said they were giving me that platform, but then I was actually very restricted through the spokesperson training. I realized I was very restricted. But I still thought, if it's not me, it'll be someone else saying wacky things. So I'll do it until I'd had enough, and I realized I couldn't do it anymore. But also they changed a lot. They and they become very, very depressing and doom mongering. And even I was starting to feel anxious being in these groups, because you'd have people crying in groups, you'd have people constantly talking about their grief about the planet, and it started to just impact me, just being around these people all the time. And I just had to step away from it, because I don't think it's healthy, and I don't think it helps anyone or anything really, but that when I left, that's what I left behind. But they have changed again now. They've now said they're not going to do disruptive tactics anymore, which is a huge thing, because I argued for that in the group, and they told me we'll never do that, and now they've changed their minds. So again, different people involved now. I think they're shifting again, but I think they're old news really. They're the old game in town, aren't they? We've got Just Stop Oil now, who do the actual media grabbing actions and are pushing the conversation.
And are they many of the same people in Just Stop Oil?
They are, yeah, and it's yeah, they are, but they're the militant wing that we were always trying to moderate, that a lot of us were trying to moderate, but they've gone off and done their own thing, and they've been quite successful with that. They get funded, and they get a lot of young people on board to go and take what I consider to be quite dangerous actions. Sometimes I know what they'd say, well, you know, they're martyrs and they should put their lives on the line and blah, blah, blah. I just think it's wrong. I've just got to the point where I think it's wrong. I think it's hurting young people, actually. And again, it's not solving any problems. And they're the first to say, no one's listening. This isn't solving anything. So they carry on.
They would say they're raising awareness, I suppose, but it seems to me that this is not something that needs much more awareness raised.
Well, exactly. I think they haven't caught up with that. But also, I think that they've made it very polarized now. So people don't want to talk about issues and be involved because they don't want to be branded as these kind of extremist, you know, activists. And I think that's a shame. I think there's a way of doing activism like what I do with my group, a lot of public engagement, a lot of positive actions, just informing people, you know, encouraging them to get involved in things. I think there's a way to do it, but you know, we don't get the media coverage they get, but I'd still say we're making a lot of change on the ground. But I think, you know, a lot of the media coverage maybe has become about kind of ego and saying, well, a million people saw this, so I made a difference, but maybe a million people saw that and didn't care. You know, we don't really know the impacts of what they're doing, except that they agree themselves that no one's listening and nothing's changing. So
is there an element of it like you get with a lot of political movements where there's a sort of competition within the movement for who can be the most extreme or the most pure, as they would see it?
You know what I would say, Chris, is that when I was in Extinction Rebellion, you were encouraged to do that, and it was like I wrote in my article recently, who will be the first to cry on TV? You know, who will be the first to get the longest jail term? It's very much set up that way, but it's you know, it's sort of tricking people, and there is a kind of martyrdom to it. I remember there were some, you know, we got a lot of flack from the public, and there was one lady who had some death threats, and she was meant to speak at an event in London, in Trafalgar Square, I think it was, a couple of days later, and I advised her not to. I rang her and I said, just lay low for a bit, because this person's out there, police are looking into it, you know, they're threatening your children, it's not worth it. And she actually had taken it the opposite way. You know, if that was me, I would think, protect my family, you know, take some time out.
Sorry, who was threatening her?
It was one of the, I don't think she came, I'm not sure she talked about it publicly. It's one of the spokespeople for Extinction Rebellion. Anyway,
why were they threatening her? Sorry,
oh, just they'd seen her on Good Morning Britain and they didn't like her, and they sent her death threats, and her children, they knew her children's names, and it spooked her. But
wow.
What she took that forward as was, if something happens, it happens. This is kind of my destiny. And I was really shocked, but there is that kind of martyrdom behind a lot of these people, you know, I was never that kind of person. So things like that kept happening, where I started thinking there's something different going on here that I don't quite understand. And I still kind of don't understand that. But I guess she really believes that if she died for the cause, then it would somehow do good in the world. But you know, I don't understand it. But yeah, there's a lot of that. Unfortunate. Not in all groups. I've been in lots of other groups, very decent, normal people doing actions. But this wing of climate activism has become like that, unfortunately.
Yeah, it does have at times a bit of a sense of a death cult around it, when you see the people dressed in red and so on walking down the kind of medieval feel to it. And I've seen interviews with Roger Allen talking about, I guess, the kind of stuff that you were meant to be defending, Andrew Neil, you know, about 6 billion people are gonna die, and it's not worth having children and this kind of stuff. It's you can see how
you know, the theatrical stuff, I didn't mind that, because it's not it's not particularly disrupting anyone. It's very eye-catching, it's very creative. They have a creative outlet, great, you know, spread your message that way. Roger Hallam going on television and saying 6 million people are going to die, which is a figure that he made up, which Anthony Neal asked me to defend, which I refused to defend because I'd spent weeks inside Extinction Rebellion saying we should retract it, which they didn't agree with doing. There's that, but he's also written, you know, pamphlets and books and does talks around the UK. Even now, he still does this, where he tells young people, you know, you have no future. And it goes far beyond even what people like Greta Thunberg are saying. He's saying your life will be apocalyptic, and if you don't put your life on the line, then you will see everyone around you raped and harmed. And I'm not exaggerating. If you look up things he's writing and saying to people, I mean, it's horrific, really. And unfortunately, a lot of impressionable young people who have anxiety about many of the world's problems end up focusing on that. And he gives them a way out. He says, if you go and do this, then you'll help. And then, you know, they're young and they're not thinking about it. And they're getting swept into a movement that I think actually is doing more harm than good.
Yeah, I agree. So let's look at the problems and solutions here. And so we're not going to look at 6 billion people dying, but people are going to die. It is a big problem. You believe it can be solved. I've written a bit, I'm not by any means pretending to be any kind of expert on this. I've written a little bit about the net zero target, which seems to me with existing technology is going to be extremely difficult to achieve. But insofar as it is achievable, obviously, seems to be obvious at least, the nuclear power has got to be ramped up enormously. One thing I think a lot of people don't get about this net zero thing is it's not just a matter of replacing the existing energy with renewable or low carbon energy. We're also going to massively increase the energy demand by decarbonising transport and heating. And the figures I've heard bandied around are something along the lines, we're going to need 3 times as much electricity. I don't know if you can give me a more accurate figure. But another figure I saw just over the weekend was that the amount of electricity we're going to need is the equivalent of 27 Hinkley points. What is the scale of energy demand, and how much nuclear power would we need to meet it?
Well, look, France in the 70s and 80s had their Mesmer plan where they built lots of reactors. They had 56, I think it was, that they built over a period of about 10 to 12 years. And ever since then, they've had a low carbon energy mix. So technology does exist. Everyone could do this. Yes, now we're also electrifying everything. This has other benefits beyond net zero. You know, it's better for air pollution. I mean, you asked me if this problem's solvable. Yes, it's solvable. We're sure, you know, it's slow, but change is always slow. And I think actually in the last few years, we've seen immense progress. We've seen all kinds of things happening. You've got Sweden and Finland building deep geological repositories for long-term waste storage. This is something that they tried to do years ago in other countries, like in the US, where protesters were so against it that they weren't able to store their nuclear program because they couldn't manage the waste. You know, there's lots of things that historically have prevented us from moving forward that are now not in the way anymore. People are a lot more aware of the issues. Younger generation are more concerned about climate change than nuclear. So that kind of old school mixing up energy with weapons, you know, the old movement of just hating the atom, just hating nuclear, that's kind of on its way out now. I don't think they have as much power anymore, though they're still quite loud, and you've still got Greenpeace doing a lot of lobbying against nuclear. But ultimately, there are a lot of programs around the world to meet these goals. And if you look at the East, if you look at India and China, UAE, they're building their reactors. They're just getting on with it because they don't have the opposition. They have the workers, which is a problem we have over here, right? We have a shortage of workers in pretty much all industries, and we certainly do have delays. Things like nuclear builds get delayed because of a shortage of workers. You get workers going off sick, there's no one to replace them. It's simple as that. And you've got France committing to more reactors, realizing that going forward, as their old fleet gets shut down, they'll need more, and they actually have a drive for recruiting more workers, so they're properly thinking about it and actioning that. I've never seen so much progress. And in terms of will it save lives? Look, anytime you replace fossil fuel generation with clean energy, whether it's intermittent and some of the time renewables, or it depends which renewables, wind or solar, obviously hydropower is not intermittent, or nuclear energy, then you save lives because the numbers of people who die from air pollution go down. That's very, very well documented, and nobody seems to care about that. But that's been happening as well before we knew about climate change. Millions of people every year die from impacts from coal-fired power stations, especially people who live near them. But even if you're quite a far radius out, you still get impacted, and children have respiratory issues and all kinds of things that are completely avoidable as far as I'm concerned. You know, we've known that for a long time, but there hasn't really been a movement in favor of that, weirdly. But that's why all the arrows for me point towards clean energy. And yeah, you know, that could be a mix of renewables and nuclear, but we need to be honest about needing firm, like reliable energy, which, you know, Germany messed that up. And we need to be honest about impacts as well, and how much land things take up, and whether we have the resources to actually construct these things as well.
Interesting that you mentioned India and China, because obviously a lot of people will say, well, there's no point Britain going net zero and at great expense if the rest of the world's going to keep pumping out. We hear a lot about China building all these coal power stations. I didn't know much about their nuclear program, so they're really kicking on.
Yeah, look, they are still using a lot of coal. They're going to, because they're still in that development stage. This is what always happens historically. We did it right. We started to burn lots of coal. We lifted ourselves out of energy poverty. We were prosperous, and then we went, hang on a minute, our children are struggling to breathe. What do we do next? I mean, there's usually this transition from coal, you go through gas, ideally end up with nuclear, or some combination of nuclear and renewables. And so China's going through that industrial revolution that we had as well. We've had that over here. We're kind of on the other end now, but they're already thinking ahead to, well, what's the next transition? And that's something that we didn't do. All right, France did it, but hardly anywhere in Europe did it. And I wouldn't be surprised if they decarbonize before we do.
Really?
People have no idea. If you look at how quickly they construct things in China, it is mind-blowing. They have the workers, they have the materials, they mine it all there. I mean, they make the solar panels. I've asked solar manufacturers over here, I've asked them, why can't we build them here? Can we have factories that build them? And they said they can't compete with how cheap they are, because they come from China, because they've got so many workers and all of the resources that they control the entire solar chain, because they mine everything there. Polysilicon comes from there. We're completely dependent on them for this. They are just churning these things out. Same with wind turbines. We can't compete. They are really, I think, already the kind of global superpower. We're completely dependent on them for everything. What do we manufacture over here in Britain? What would happen if China cut off its supply to us of anything? We would have nothing. We wouldn't be able to get hold of anything. We have virtually no manufacturing.
Isn't that partly because we have a lot of these climate change targets, and it makes it very difficult for heavy industry to exist in this country?
Sure, but that's because they're not calculating it right, because you should be calculating that cost even if you're importing things.
Yeah,
that shouldn't be written off. So if they did it sensibly, look, it could be done very easily. All of these things could be tackled very easily. People need good jobs. Great. Give out a load of engineering apprenticeships, encourage people to go into these industries, and then ensure that they have good jobs. I mean, there are good jobs. Nuclear workers do have good jobs, but encourage them to go into those jobs. And they get to hold those jobs for a long time. These power plants can run 60 years, you know. They take up a very small amount of space, which is important when you don't have a lot of land, like in Britain. And people oppose, I mean, one of the things people oppose everything, not just nuclear, but so, you know, solar farms get rejected here. People oppose pretty much anything, housing development. So we almost, I really think we're kind of deindustrializing. And if you look at India and China, they're the opposite. But they're not just the opposite. They're not just where we were. They're thinking ahead from where we were. And look, China, out of everywhere in the world, every country in the world, China invests the most in science. People don't realize this. They're really just crashing ahead. And we've got, what have we got? We've got Germany. I mean, there's a deindustrialization going on in Germany, right? They're now talking about, because of this continued energy shortage, having to shut down key manufacturing firms. So that's one thing Germany did have. And you've got all these manufacturers saying, we can't weather this. We can't afford the energy prices. We're being told to stop, you know, using electricity after 5 p.m. We're being told to ration. this won't work going forward. Who can compete with that? Somewhere with abundant energy, somewhere like China, and they are building, they've got aims to build over 100 reactors. So when they say they're thinking ahead, they're really thinking ahead to that transition.
How quickly are they building these reactors? Because one objection you hear, the kind of Nick Clegg objection, is always going to take 12 or 15 years to build.
Yeah,
I never understand why it takes that long.
The average build time is 7 years. It takes a much longer time in a lot of Europe because of over-the-top regulations. Look, I understand everybody wants nuclear to be regulated, but it is more heavily regulated than oil and gas in many circumstances. I wrote about this recently in terms of waste management. It's so over the top, and it doesn't need to be. I understand people are afraid, and that's why it's come to that, but it slows everything down to the point that I spoke to workers when I went on a tour recently of Hinkley Point C, and they were telling me that if they run out of one brand of duct tape, they can't use, or one specific brand of nail, they can't just go and buy a replacement. They have to order that specific, it's the only one that's signed off. There's so much red tape. And if that takes a week, what do they do for a week?
Indeed.
It's that ridiculous. The regulation is that ridiculous. Like, there's safety, I understand about that, but they've made it so over the top. And that is because of years of environmentalists.
Yeah.
Lobbying, say make it safer, it's not safe. They've made it so over the top restricted, and that it's very hard once that's there for that to be pared back, and it needs to be. We need to take a real look at what we're doing and what South Korea is doing and ask why they're building reactors in 3 years and ours are taking 12, because the technology is not that different. That is, and you can build them in 3-4 years. Many countries have been able to do so. And
they're all kind of out of the box, as it were, right? They're not like very different.
It's basically no, they're not different. It's one of the few areas where you don't need to innovate. It's like a Lego model. You just build the same reactor again and again. So we are doing that. So it's being done at Hinkley. Now those workers are transferring that knowledge to Sizewell. That should be a lot quicker, but it's still just not on a scale. Like, I can just imagine China's they're just gonna churn them out. They're not going to stop for a week because they ran out of the right duct tape or they've got people protesting on site. They're not going to have any of that. They understand energy poverty, that is very recent to them. They understand that the air pollution is very dangerous because they can see it it's very visible in many places, and they understand that that's not good, that's harming people. Obviously, there's lots of criticisms you can make of China, but in this regard, I think they're really leaping ahead, and there's lots of other countries as well doing it quietly, while Europe kind of has had, we've done the opposite, and yet now there's a bit of a turnaround, and people are starting to think about building reactors. But the first one always takes the longest because you don't have that expertise, you don't have the workers, you don't have the chain in place. The way to do it is to standardize. That's what they showed in South Korea. Each one cost less and was quicker to build after the first one. It's not that, it's just like when you make a Lego model with your kids.
So Henry Ford model, yeah. So let's just quickly take 3 objections to nuclear power that I can think of off the top of my head. One would be obviously nuclear disasters, Chernobyl, Fukushima, and so on. Second would be nuclear waste. Is it safe? What do you do with it? And the third would be cost. A lot of people say, well, actually, it's cheaper to do. Very similar. So each of those intense. So nuclear disasters, when's the next one going to be? How can we, is it too dangerous?
Nuclear disasters will still happen, but they are not as bad as everybody thinks. And first of all, the ones that people always give an example of are Chernobyl, Fukushima, and 3 Mile Island, because these are considered to be the worst. Okay, so what happened in these cases? Chernobyl, they used a flawed reactor design. It was an RBMK model because the Soviet Union had made it and they wanted to use it. And that reactor actually exploded. Now, other reactors are not capable of exploding, even in a meltdown. That cannot happen. But the RBMK had that flaw. They're still used across Russia, but after Chernobyl, they've got upgraded, so they're protected now, so they can't explode. But that was completely a combination of poor reactor design and then secrecy, because once it happened, they kept it secret and they didn't tell people, and they didn't evacuate the area. But even then, do you know how many people died at Chernobyl?
No.
30 people.
Right.
Now, there were more people that had radiation poisoning because they weren't evacuated. Radiation poisoning in small doses is treatable. Again, that they didn't have any of that in place. But even from those deaths, it's negligible. Like, if you look at the actual figures, somewhere like Our World in Data that has the actual numbers, a lot of green groups have said made claims that there were thousands of deaths, they were covered up, there's lots of radiation, and that's what I used to believe. And when I actually looked into it, I found all the reports, and there have been many reports now, and there are many people who've been out there and measured the radiation levels and looked at what actually happened. It just wasn't, you know, I'm not saying it wasn't terrible. I'm not saying that the deaths don't matter, but you've got to look at it in the context of the alternatives. And the alternatives of fossil fuels are so infinitely worse. Fukushima, no one died, not one person. Do you know the death toll from Fukushima? People panicked so badly they got into accidents, and there were a few hundred deaths because of the fear. And it later turned out that they didn't need to be evacuated. And that's fine that they did evacuate. They shouldn't have panicked people. That instant media panic and fear that people have is more harmful than nuclear energy. 3 Mile Island, no one died. So all of them are cases of scaremongering and taking this story and really scaring people. And I always say, actually, if you look at the real disasters like the Deepwater Horizon spill, the Exxon Valdez spill, the Jaria coal fires that are still raging in India, these have taken so many lives and harmed the environment so much, but we don't think about them. No one throws those words around like Fukushima and Chernobyl. All of that has come from activist messaging from people who are against nuclear, and it's fed into just ordinary people who then are scared and use those as reasons, and they're not reasons, because it's very easy to look at a chart. Again, Our World in Data has a really good one on energy. What is the death toll from all these different energy sources? Nuclear is right down there with solar and wind, because accidents happen in all areas, right? And that includes all the meltdowns. Even hydropower is above nuclear. You know why? Banker Dam disaster, over 100,000 people died in one go. Millions of homes are flooded, right, when that happened. That's hydropower.
Yeah,
nobody's protesting hydropower. All of this has come from activist messaging. So I really urge people to rethink where they've got these fears from. Waste, I've just written a really long article on waste.
I know, that's what reminded me, yeah.
It's very comprehensive. It's on my Substack. You can just find it by looking at my name. I recommend it because everything is in there. It's not something you can just quickly churn out. But I would say that of all industries, not even just in energy, but of all industries, nuclear waste is managed better than anything else. That's because of those tight regulations. You have to jump through hoops even to go and see it. And it's just so buried in this huge casks, which are tested by flying planes into them, right? The casks don't even dent. You can watch the videos online. Again, it's linked to my article. It's so ridiculously safe. But what we should really be doing is reprocessing it, recycling it, because at the end, after it's been used, there's still about 97% of it is reusable. And France does that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they already do that. And we often
how do you do that?
So they have reprocessing facilities on site at where the power plants are, so they don't even take up much more space. What you need to do once the waste comes out, it's chemically dirty, so clean it, but then there's still a lot of energy, and then by reusing that, they reduce their need for fresh uranium because they're reusing it. So it's all in my article. Sorry, yeah, technically it is, isn't it? So all of this is in my article, and if you look at that, it's referenced. So you can look at all the data. You don't have to take my word for it. I've referenced everything. If you think I missed a reference, leave a comment and I'll find you one. But it really is just not something to fear. Meanwhile, we're breathing fossil fuel waste every day. Every day it's stored in the Earth's atmosphere. Every day people are getting respiratory issues because we're breathing this stuff. No one says, what about the waste? It's all come from activist messaging. The nuclear fears have all come from that, and it's led us for a long time, and I think it's really time for us to move forward, move away from it.
Okay, and finally, and we're coming up to the last couple of minutes, this is well timed, I think. Finally, cost. People say it's really expensive to get. Is that just because of regulation in England, or is it inherently expensive? Yeah, some of it is regulation. Look, it is an expensive upfront cost, but you have to think these reactors can run for 60 years. So yeah, France paid a huge cost back in the 70s. And how long have they had clean energy for? To now, they're only just some of those reactors are starting to go offline, so they're replacing them. So you have to think long-term over cost. You also have to think in context. If you look at the alternatives, okay, renewables, you can have a lot of wind and solar, but people don't factor in, when they talk about wind turbines and solar panels, they don't factor in the cost of the backup for when it's, because it's intermittent, right? So that's either fossil fuels or nuclear. At the moment, it's usually fossil fuels. So what about the backup cost of that? So because what happens is you have to leave coal or coal-fired power stations generating, even if you're not using a huge amount, to be able to provide that backup. And people don't know about that.
Secondly, if you really want a huge grid with lots of renewables, which something like Australia's trying at the moment, you have to pay for all the wires and poles. You have to pay for the actual grid because it doesn't exist. This is a huge cost. And they're finding this now because they're building these huge batteries and they are very, very expensive. And people are starting to realize that actually where they're building them, the cost to consumer for their energy bills at home are going up exponentially. But I'm not saying that we shouldn't build stuff. It's all expensive is the point. Nuclear is not more expensive. It could be done in a more expensive way. It could be done in a cheaper way. What China's doing where they're just going to turn them out, that will make them so cheap.
Why is it the government always seems to have to come up with a capital for this? I mean, is it because it's just such a long lead-in time to actually make
and also
returns?
the industry wants that reassurance. So this is the problem we've had in Britain where we had a site at Wilfer in Wales, and actually the community there was really pro getting this power station there because it's a very deprived area. I spoke to people there who said all the kids just leave because there's no jobs. They were going to, the industry was going to give a lot of money to the area to be able to build the power station there, plus the jobs and the apprenticeships. And because the government wouldn't kind of match the funding, the industry pulled out. Westinghouse, not EDF. They pulled out because they want that assurance that this project is not just going to be abandoned by the next government or, abandoned at any point. They want to make sure they need that assurance. And once that's established, great, you could do what they do in France, but it's not established here. And all that really proved is that we're not trustworthy for these investors to come in, and they have to come in if we want them to build stuff. So yeah, that was a really sad, and there's still people trying to fight to get something sited at Wilfer. It's a great site for a nuclear power station, and people really want it there, which is unusual. So I'm hoping that works out. But yeah, these projects, look, it's always hard to get any large construction project off the ground, and everything takes a long time. People say it takes 12 years for nuclear. Do you know the average time for an offshore wind farm in France is 10 years? It takes 10 years, a huge amount of concrete that you have to put in the seas, huge amount of infrastructure. It requires a lot of energy too. Some not small projects. They often overrun. They often take a long time, and they are not cheap. They cost a lot of money. But I just think you can't say on the one hand save the world, and then on the other hand say now that's too expensive.
Yeah, right. I'm afraid we're out of time. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. It's gone very quickly, but that's why we like it on the show. Is there anything you want to plug or tell us about before we go?
emergencyreactor.org. We have a mailing list, and we do actions around the UK where we're keen for people to turn up and volunteer and get involved. Also, please check out my Substack because I do back everything up that I say on there. So it's just my name on Substack. Thank you.
Go to the Substack. I'm a subscriber. It's very good. Thank you very much, Zion. That's tremendous. Thank you very much at home for watching. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. Usual thing. Don't know who's going to be speaking to, but I'm sure it'll be somebody interesting. If you want to give us some money, if you want to donate in the meantime, iea.org.uk/donate or patreon.com/IEA London. Thanks for watching. Take care and goodbye.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.